are tracking developments in the trial of 3 Tacoma police officers in the death of Manuel Ellis. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christine Pay. Ellis died while being restrained by police in March of 2020. Officers Matthew Collins, Christopher Burbank, and Timothy Rankine are all facing charges in his death. King 5 is live streaming the entire trial from opening to closing statements. We take you now to the courtroom live.
But we did have some other Pierce County folks who would provide the more thorough testing, but they wouldn't be able to be here till this afternoon. So we did give out the tests at noon. I believe it was right after we broke, and we've got 4 people took the tests. All 4 had negative results, so no problems there. And asked them if they wanted to follow up more serious test. They all declined. So those folks aren't coming in. We still have a number of these rapid tests. So if any of the lawyers or their staff folks want them, we're going to have a box of them in the back here in Chambers at the end of the day. If you still want some, let Mrs. Winnie know. We'll bring them out. Okay. Now, is there anything else we need to talk about? Well, I guess I would say that we noticed that there was the rally, and they were nice enough not to use any amplified noise. And so I think that worked out just fine. And I don't know whether my words had anything to do with it. If they did, that's great. If they didn't, that's just great too. So whatever it is, I don't think that was something that would have implicated any issues with respect to the jurors. So hopefully it'll remain that way for the duration of our trial. I think there's still some people there now, but anyway, can't hear them here in the courtroom. So, without any further ado, any reason we couldn't put Officer Ford back on the stand?
One scheduling question. I have Dr. Stankus here for this afternoon. I don't anticipate that we're going to get to Dr. Reese. So I was planning on texting him and letting him know that he doesn't need to come today.
I think that's reasonable. We got a late start this morning through nobody's fault. It just happened. And but we did have a lot of things we had to sort of think about and make decisions on, and that did slow things up. I don't think Officer Ford got on the stand till a little after 11, and of course we had hoped to get him on the stand at 9:30 or thereabouts. So we lost an hour and a half, and that makes all the difference, I'm sure. So yes, I have no problem in cutting Dr. Reese loose. Okay, so are we ready to resume with Officer Ford?
Yes.
Great, let's have the jury, Mrs. Winnie. And Ms. Bremner, are you going to stay there, or you want to? Are you going to? Okay.
I'll go now, thank you.
I just thought it might be easier on you.
I know. I thought I was the best in the house. Right? Not wearing heels. Should Officer Ford resume the stand?
Sure, Officer Ford can come on back.
A little lighter now. Do you need water up there, officer?
I've got a water bottle. Thank you.
Just the first one.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Please be seated. Okay, Ms. Bremner, you can resume when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Officer Ford.
Hello, ma'am.
I wanted to ask you about, you testified that you saw fire coming over the hill. Do you remember that?
Yes.
What hill were you talking about?
There's a small hill between, I think it's like Yakima, 96 and Yakima, roughly.
How far away about is the hill from where you were situated?
I think about 7 or 8 blocks, roughly.
So you saw it in a distance rounding the corner?
Going down the
The
hill.
hill, right. So you saw it from a distance going down the hill. When you said before, you talked about seeing fire.
Yes.
Was that where you saw the fire response?
Yes.
Okay. Did you find a Glock magazine
Glock magazine?
or any kind of weapon magazine at the scene?
Not that I remember, no.
Do you remember anything related to weapons at the scene?
Just taser probes.
Okay. Was there any kind of, can you tell the jury whether or not there's any kind of a pat down for weapons of Mr. Ellis?
I believe one was performed when he was put in the recovery position, which is when I saw the taser probes were sticking out of his legs, or out of his body.
And who performed that?
I remember taking the taser probes out of him.
Okay. And did you see anybody else pat him down?
I was pretty focused on the taser probes at that time.
Okay. And did you get them all out?
Yes, there were 2.
How difficult was it to control Mr. Ellis when he was in hobbles?
It wasn't difficult at all, really.
What was he doing while he was in hobbles, if anything, to resist or fight?
Other than thrashing around that one time, nothing.
What do you mean by thrashing around?
Like he would start moving his legs again in his body.
When fire got there, did you talk to anyone, any fire personnel?
Yes.
And what did you say to them, if anything?
When I ran up to get them from their rig, I said, hey, I think this is possible because I had delirium. Mr. Ellis was unresponsive at that time, so I told them we needed them there as soon as possible.
Did you say anything to them about whether you've been fighting?
I'm pretty sure I said that we just fought with him and got him into hobble restraints.
You said why you did.
I believe I said something along the lines of we had to fight him into hobble restraints.
And did you or anybody at the scene refuse to work with fire in terms of getting him aid?
No.
From what you remember for the whole incident, and I'm talking about the whole incident from when you arrived as backup up until the time that fire arrived, for the most part, was Mr. Ellis in the recovery position during that time or in the prone position? Objective, leading.
Overruled, you may answer.
That's hard to quantify. I don't really know because I remember we were struggling with him when we got there.
Mm-hmm.
He was placed in the hobble restraints, put into the recovery position, then briefly back into prone, then back into recovery. I'm not sure how much time elapsed. I'm sorry.
Would it be about equal time? Objection, leading.
Sustained.
So you can't quantify whether he was majority in the recovery position or majority prone for that time?
No.
Is there anything else that comes to your mind about what happened out there from the jury? I'm going to object on the date.
Sustained.
In terms of the chronology that we went through this morning, was that an accurate chronology of what you observed and what you did at the scene?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, that's all I know.
Okay, Ms. Eakes, cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Officer Ford.
Good morning, ma'am.
All right, just want to follow up on some of your testimony. You testified that you heard Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And is it correct that that happened just a moment or two after the hobbles were applied to him?
Yes, I believe so, ma'am.
And defendant Burbank was there when you heard Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe?
I would assume so if it was just a moment after he applied the hobbles,
Okay.
but I'm not 100% sure.
Object to, if it's going for speculation, or
But if you know, if you're saying you assume, then you're now sort of putting things together as opposed to what you actually recall from what your observations were that night.
I apologize, sir.
It's okay. So
You had just,
you said he apologized for that.
no, okay.
So you wanted to hear his other answer?
No, I didn't hear that one, so.
Okay.
when the hobbles were applied, just so that we're clear, it was you and Officer Collins at Mr. Ellis's feet, correct?
That is correct.
And defendant Rankine and defendant Burbank controlling his upper body, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so all four of you, or look, sorry, defendant Collins was there then when you heard Mr. Ellis say that he couldn't breathe.
Yes, I believe so. Yes, ma'am.
And defendant Rankine was there when you heard Mr. Ellis say that he couldn't breathe.
Yes.
Now, you heard somebody respond back to Mr. Ellis, correct, when he said he couldn't breathe?
Yes.
And that person said, if you can talk, you can breathe.
That is
Right.
correct.
And that was said sarcastically?
Objection, that's a little bit
I don't believe that is, Your Honor. There was, but it was.
You can ask him how it was said. You haven't asked him, you haven't identified who said that.
I'm getting there.
Well, I would say you can ask him how it was said.
How was it said?
I would say it was kind of sarcastic.
And that's how you've described it previously, correct?
Yes.
And you were trying to de-escalate the situation with Mr. Ellis
Yes, ma'am.
with that comment? I'm sorry, you were trying to de-escalate Mr. Ellis at the time the comment was made, correct?
Yes, I was telling him, relax, the fire department's coming, you're going to get help, you'll be okay, things like that.
And you didn't think that comment of, if you can talk, you can breathe, was helpful to the situation, correct?
An order in limine, speculation, elements.
Sustained.
Now, through your training, you were never taught that if someone could talk, they could breathe, right?
That is,
Order in limine on training for this officer.
I'll allow that question.
can you repeat the question one more time, please?
During your training, you never were taught that if someone says that if someone can talk, that means that they can breathe.
No, I was not.
And the judge raised the issue, and I'll ask you, do you know who made the comment, if you can talk, you can breathe?
Objection, be the order in limine.
Overruled.
I thought it was Officer Chung.
And you don't recall, you believe it was Officer Chung?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall that previously you said that you didn't recall who made the comment?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled.
Well, that one would that have been?
Well, I'll show you. Do you remember you gave some statements in this case?
Yes, many.
And you gave a statement to the Pierce County Sheriff's Office on March 9th, 2020, correct?
That is correct.
And then you gave a statement to your department, to Tacoma Police Department, on August 24th, 2021?
That is correct.
And then you interviewed with the state and the defense in both November and December of 2021. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
All right, so I'm going to show you one of the transcripts from your November 29th to 2022 interview, if I may approach, Your Honor. Handing you what's been marked as Exhibit 760.
Okay.
And if you could turn to page 113, and I'd direct your attentions to lines 3 and 4.
I know we have the exhibit number, but
Who was with,
to identify which interview this is.
I can ask some additional questions.
please? Go ahead.
And looking at that transcript, if you can look at the front of it first, Officer Ford. Recall that that is the day one of your interview with the state and the defense in this case.
November 29th? Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, if you could take a look at page 113, lines 3 and 4.
Okay.
And do you recall being asked about who made the comment of, if you can talk, you can breathe?
Yes, I do.
And what did you answer?
I said, I don't know, but it really annoyed me.
Thank you. I don't have another question about that. So I wanted to ask you, prior to this incident, you were trained on the dangers of having a suspect in a prone position, is that right?
In the academy, I believe so, yes.
And you were taught that leaving somebody in the prone position created a risk of positional asphyxiation, correct?
John?
I'll permit this, overruled.
And, is that right? Do you want me to restate the question?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. You were taught that leaving someone in the prone position could create the risk of positional asphyxiation, right?
And I object further that it's vague, ambiguous.
Overruled. You may answer.
What I recall from that section of training is they're talking about when officers, for lack of better words, dogpile onto a suspect and remain in that position for an extended period of time, and that's when it becomes an issue.
You were taught there was a risk of keeping someone in the prone position, correct?
Objection, yes, the answer.
Well, if I can allow him to answer, you can further explain it.
Yes,
And you were trained that to reduce that danger of positional asphyxiation, you should put the suspect in a recovery position once they're under control, correct?
that is correct.
And under control in law enforcement means in handcuffs, is that right?
Objection calls for legal conclusion, speculation, vague.
Overruled. I'll allow him to answer the question.
Typically,
mean-
oh, go ahead.
Typically, it means that.
Typically-
No, not typically.
Okay, well, I thought that's what you were gonna say. Go ahead.
Wait a minute, the question is when do you regard a suspect as under control?
Does that mean that it's in handcuffs? That was my question.
Well, that was your question. My question is, and this is what we're going to ask, when do you regard a suspect as under control?
When they're following commands, typically in handcuffs as well, and under control, meaning not kicking, not screaming, not trying to run away or escape.
And at the time of this incident, you understood that you would almost never leave someone handcuffed in a prone position. Is that right?
Objection, it's vague, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Well, why don't you take a look at your transcript again there? If you could take a look at page 30 and 31.
Counsel, if you want to ask him when it would be appropriate or inappropriate to leave a person in a prone position, that's fine. And then only if there's an inconsistent response should we get to something
When
else.
would you leave somebody in the prone position?
Almost never.
Thank you. Now, you also understood from your training that you weren't supposed to put pressure on the center of a suspect's back when they're prone. Is that right?
We were taught in academy that you're supposed to typically put like your knee on the shoulder area.
Right. Not in the center of the back?
That is correct.
And that you only put the knee on the shoulder when you're handcuffing, correct?
Yes.
And that's what you learned in the academy?
Yes, ma'am.
As a training, Your Honor,
He's already answered this. This is what he was taught.
thank you.
And you were also taught that in controlled tactics at Tacoma Police, correct?
That is correct.
And you were aware that Officer Collins is a controlled tactics instructor?
I was not aware of that, no.
You weren't aware of that? Okay. And you were never taught also to put your knee in the lower center back of a person when they're in the prone position, correct?
It's not relevant, this officer.
Well, I'm going to excuse the jury for a minute while we have this conversation. Okay, you guys can be seated. Officer Ford, please excuse us.
Out in the hallway.
The door's closed now. I've allowed you to ask some questions about what his training was and so on, and he's answered your questions, and I've allowed him over some objection here. What's beginning to bother me about this, Ms. Eakes, though, is there's now a series of leading questions on this issue in which you're trying to treat him like an expert witness.
I'm not seeking to treat him like an expert
Oh,
witness.
oh, that's exactly what you're doing.
Well,
And so don't kid me with that. That's what you're doing. And it's one thing to do that with respect to things that they saw and what have you, especially when it's not a witness. It's called by you. But there's a risk here, it seems to me, of sort of half a story and not the whole story that's being created by a series of lead questions. He said, oh, I'd almost never leave a person in a prone position. Well, what does that mean? Well, we had this whole context of this other conversation about when he's under control. But that wasn't part of the question, but it was part of other questions. So does that mean you should never do it when the person's under control, or does that mean you should never do it, period? Now, I don't know necessarily what the answer to that is, but by a series of leading questions, we've gotten to this point where now it's become ambiguous, and I don't want this to get any worse.
Well, Your Honor, I would just point out this is cross-examination.
I understand that.
Counsel is perfectly capable of asking other questions.
I understand that.
on Cross-examination.
I understand
I
that.
would also point out that the goal is not to try to use him as an expert witness, but counsel got up and you let the defense ask repeatedly whether or not he saw anything wrong, anything inappropriate,
Right.
and whether or not they'd followed anything. And the fact of the matter is,
Right.
he didn't follow the procedures in what he was
Right,
telling.
and you've gone, and I've allowed you to do some of that. But now the questions are now more generic in terms of training, because he said the talk you can breathe business, what his reaction was to that, or what he thought about it. About positional asphyxia, he said, well, it's an issue if there's a dog pile and it's a suspect with weight on them for an extended period of time. He says that, but then he also say, well, when would you leave somebody in a prone position for an extended period of time? Well, I would almost never do that. So we're getting answers that are your answers, not the witness's answers, by the way with which this is leading.
Well, Your Honor, this is
And-
cross-examination, and I would
Yeah,
suggest.
hold on. And to the extent you're treating him as an expert witness, which was how I prefaced all this, I think that becomes inappropriate. In general, yes, leading questions are appropriate on cross-examination. In general, but we're not talking about what he saw that night and what was good, bad, or indifferent about that night. Now you're talking about generically about training.
Well, I'm talking generically about training that he brought to that situation. And the fact that he would say, hey, there's nothing wrong on prompting by defense counsel repeatedly, I never saw anything inappropriate, nobody did anything inappropriate. What they did was contrary to his training. And so establishing that he was trained on these things, and that the jury can draw their own conclusion as to whether or not he's credible when he says that nothing that they did was, that there was anything inappropriate.
I would
If
say-
you're trained to do something differently, and you chose not to on this night, I think that goes to his credibility. And that's all I'm,
Well,
that's simply all I'm trying to establish.
And you could ask them about that if you get to the point of this incident, as opposed to generic training.
Well, I'm getting to that point, but they're asking him about his general training so that they understand it. It's not just this night, it's also what he knew about the way that they should treat suspects when they came into the.
This is not a civil litigation,
I understand that.
so it isn't about other nights. It's about this night.
It's about this night, but the training that they brought into it is important.
Right, and as I say, I've allowed you to do some of that, but then this has now gotten with this last question, it seems to be too far. And too generic. It's not related to the night. So if you want to ask him about, well, you said you saw this, that he was in the prone position, that Officer Rankine was positioned on him, you didn't think that was, well, why not, if you would almost never leave a person in a prone position? Something along those lines would be perfectly fine.
I'll try to tailor the questions more to this night, but I think that, the defense is capable of asking questions on cross-examination or on their examination, and I'm sure they will.
I'm aware of that. Okay. Let's have the jury and let's have a new question.
remind me what my last question was so that I don't ask the same question. Oh, did I ask a question after that? Because I thought that's what the judge was objecting to. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Please be seated. Okay, Ms. Eakes, let's have a new question.
Thank you. Officer Ford, you would agree that once Mr. Ellis was hobbled and handcuffed, he was under control, correct?
Yes.
And you had a number of other officers at the scene with Mr. Ellis, correct?
That is correct.
And when you have additional officers at a scene, as you did here with Mr. Ellis, you would agree that those officers can help so that you don't have to use maximum restraints such as a hobble, correct?
Depending on the situation, yes.
And how many officers were at this scene?
You may answer.
I'm not sure exactly, but at least a dozen.
And you would agree with a dozen officers at the scene with Mr. Ellis that you could have picked him up off the ground, correct?
I don't know what the context is for that, but I guess I'll allow the question.
Can you say the question one more time, please?
With that many officers at the scene, a dozen officers at the scene, you would agree that you could have picked Mr. Ellis up off the ground, correct?
Same impressions, it's just noted down.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes.
And you have done that before in other situations, correct?
Yes.
And when people weren't cooperating with you, if you had sufficient resources, you personally have picked people up and taken them off the ground, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And put them into a patrol car?
Yes.
Now, once Mr. Ellis was under control and he was in hobbles and he was handcuffed, you would agree that the officers had a caretaking responsibility to Mr. Ellis, correct?
Object foundation, right.
When you say the officers, who are you referring to?
I'll ask you specifically about yourself. Did you have a caretaking function?
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am.
And the other officers who were involved in arresting Mr. Ellis also had a
Your
caretaking
Honor, I
function
would
to him,
object.
correct?
I'm going to object to the character, well, I think the question is mischaracterizing the evidence. It's putting Officer Hall there at the same time after he's hobbled, which we know is not the case. Mr. East knows that's not the case. And it's confusing the issues in this case. And she's already, Mr. Ford's already testified as well. There's been other testimony that once Lynn was there, he's in charge.
Your Honor,
of
I'm
the
going to
scene.
object to the speaking objection.
Right, but there is the issue of who was responsible for what and when. And to that extent, I suppose this is fine, but it may well be that some of these things were done by other people than the defendants, and that's why I think it's important to know that if somebody who is not a defendant did something they shouldn't have done or failed to do something they shouldn't have done, that's not the responsibility of the defendants potentially, right? So that's why I think it's important we identify who is responsible for what and when, if we can. So that's why I say when you say the officers generically, that doesn't tell me anything about what the defendants did or didn't do in a particular circumstance. So I'll allow the question, but we do have to make sure we're careful about not blaming the defendants for something someone else did. Go ahead.
Officer Ford, you acknowledge that you had a caretaking function towards Mr. Ellis, correct?
That is correct.
And you would agree that Defendant Rankine, Officer Rankine, had a caretaking function towards Mr. Ellis, correct?
Yes.
And Defendant Burbank, Officer Burbank, also had a caretaking function towards Mr. Ellis, correct?
Your Honor, again, I would object to it because it's taken out of context as when that caretaking function began. And,
You want to voir dire the witness?
sure,
I'll let you. Go ahead.
good afternoon, Officer Ford.
Hello, sir.
The caretaking function, when does that begin?
As soon as we use force on someone.
As soon as you get them under control?
Yes.
And in this case, I think your testimony was, he was only under control after the hobbles were placed on him, is that correct?
That is correct.
And when the hobbles were placed on him, officers Burbank and Collins were no longer hands-on at that point, correct?
Shortly thereafter, they left, yes.
Okay, and Sergeant Lim was there at that time, correct?
Yes,
And he was in charge of the scene as the sergeant, correct?
that is correct.
And
Your
everyone
Honor,
had
this
to
is
follow his orders,
cross-examination.
correct? Everyone had to follow his orders, correct?
That is correct.
And he determined who would do what, correct?
If he gives an order, yes, sir.
So, and as far as the caretaking function, people who were present after the hobbles were placed on him, whoever they may be, those people would have that caretaking function, correct?
That is correct.
And caretaking function would be like talking to him like you did,
Yes.
putting him in a recovery position?
Your Honor, again, this is outside the voir dire. This is cross-examination.
Overruled, you may continue.
Put him in a recovery position?
That is correct.
And try, at least attempting to make sure he didn't hit his head on the ground?
That is correct, yes.
Or hurt himself or hurt anybody else?
Yes.
And again, that only started once all of you, or at least you being there, thought he was under control.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just one follow-up.
Go ahead.
If I understand correctly, Officer Ford, when you put Mr.
That is correct.
And at that point, he was no longer under control, and you had to put him back in the prone position, is that right?
That is correct.
Continue, Ms. Eakes.
So Officer Ford, you're saying that because Mr. Ellis, even though he's hogtied, he's fully restrained, when he thrashes on his side, he's no longer under control?
Hold on.
As soon as facts not in evidence, use the return.
Let her continue with your question. Go ahead.
Are you saying that even though he's hogtied and he's thrashing around, he's somehow not under control?
That is correct.
He couldn't walk, could he?
No.
He couldn't get up and move?
Not very easily, no.
And that's the reason why you have a caretaking function to somebody, correct?
What do you mean by caretaking function? Can you clarify that, please?
Overruled.
Well, you
The
said
witness
that you
is
have a
asking for this to be clarified.
correct?
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
The witness asked Ms. Eakes to explain what she means by a caretaking function when she asked him about that. So let him answer the question.
You said that you had a caretaking function, correct?
That is correct.
And what do you mean by a caretaking function?
Summoning the fire department, making sure that they don't hurt themselves or others.
Only the fire department has a caretaking function?
Summoning the fire department.
Summoning the fire
Yes.
department, okay. Well, don't you have an obligation to ensure that somebody is, for example, breathing before the fire department gets there?
Yes.
And that their injuries are being tended to, correct?
If we have the supplies on us, yes. But
And that's because that person who's restrained is not able to help themselves, correct?
that is correct.
Now, as officer, you had training in first aid, is that right, that night?
Yes.
And also in CPR?
Yes.
And you had been trained to recognize when people had breathing issues?
Yes.
And you had been trained to recognize if someone was unresponsive, correct?
That is correct.
Would you agree that in your caretaking function, that it's critical for an officer to make sure that aid is able to quickly get to somebody who urgently needs it?
Yes, that is correct.
And have you had people who have died because aid hasn't gotten there quickly?
Objection, use facts, foundation.
I'll sustain the objection, and I'm not sure what the relevance of that is.
If someone like Mr. Ellis, or when Mr. Ellis said he can't breathe, you would agree that it was critical to get aid to him quickly, correct?
Yes.
And you were trained, were you not, in a situation like Mr. Ellis's where he said he couldn't breathe, that you should call for medical aid,
That is correct.
no matter what position that person is in, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And it doesn't matter if Mr. Ellis is on the ground or if he's in a patrol car, you should get aid to him, correct?
That is correct.
And you should ask aid to come to the scene priority?
Yes.
Now, when you arrived at the scene, Mr. Ellis was already in handcuffs, correct?
That is correct.
And you said on direct a couple of times that after Mr. Ellis was hobbled, that he had overpowered officers. Do you recall saying that?
After he was hobbled?
Yes.
Objection, use facts, not evidence.
She's asking him, did he say that?
Understood, Your Honor.
I remember saying before he was in hobbles, he was overpowering us.
Okay. And so before he was in hobbles, but he was already handcuffed, you said that he was overpowering you, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Ellis never actually got off the ground while you were there, correct?
No.
And he didn't have the use of his hands when he was in handcuffs?
That is correct.
And from the time that you arrived, you never saw Mr. Ellis strike Officer Burbank, did you?
No.
And you never saw him strike Officer Collins, did you?
No.
And you never saw him kick Officer Burbank, did you?
No.
And you never saw him kick Officer Collins, did you?
No.
And in fact, what you described in terms of his legs was that he was flailing and not necessarily kicking at the officers, correct?
That is correct.
And you talked about how Mr. Ellis was moving the officers the four of you, when you were trying to pin him to the ground. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And you would agree that Mr. Ellis only moved the officers a couple of feet, correct?
I believe that's what I said in previous testimony, yes.
And that's what you said in previous statements, correct?
That is correct.
And you agree with that today, that he only moved you a couple of feet, correct?
That is correct.
So you weren't moved out into the eastbound lane of Ainsworth, correct?
That's correct.
And I think you described Mr. Ellis's movement when you said he was bucking as a worm-like motion, correct?
Yes.
And when you got there, at least, when you realized he was cuffed, Officer Burbank was on Mr. Ellis's back,
That is correct.
and Defendant Collins was on Mr. Ellis's legs, is that right?
That is correct.
And then Officer Rankine, Defendant Rankine, also joined Officer Burbank on his back, is that correct?
That is correct.
Isn't it true that Mr. Ellis actually said that he couldn't breathe multiple times?
I only recall the one time.
If we could play, I want to have you listen and look at a recording and tell me if you recall hearing this.
He doesn't recall. I mean, what's she gonna do?
I'm entitled to ask him whether or not the recordings are the time that he says Mr. Ellis said he couldn't breathe.
He's,
Your Honor, he's answered the question. He's been called once.
I sustained the objection. That's his testimony.
Well, you said it was a remarkably calm voice that he used?
Yes.
And I'd like to play Exhibit 614 and ask whether or not that was the time that's heard on that Mr. Ellis had said he couldn't breathe.
Objection and foundation, you're finding it's small, we don't know which one it is.
Well,
And I think it's
hold on a second.
403, I think it's 403.
I'm excuse the jury for a second while we try to sort this out. Please do not discuss the case, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, you can be seated, everybody. 614 is a Vivint video, right?
Correct.
And
And you can hear on 614, it's a small clip, but you can hear the statements. And I'd ask Officer Ford to be excused.
what difference does it make? It's a video. If he's done.
Well, I'm going to describe the reason I want to ask him, Your Honor.
All right, excuse us. Please, officer, thank you. Well, now, is the audio on this the one that's taken from the Vivint video?
Correct.
Wasn't there an audio from the dispatch?
Yes, that's 659. I'm also going to, my intent was to have that played also.
And the dispatch one has a part of it where Sergeant Lem is calling in for medical aid.
659 is just the clip that is just this other portion.
I'm sorry?
659 is the clip that's just the dispatch portion.
Okay. And at 659, that's the one where we hear Sergeant Lem requesting medical aid.
Not 659. 659 is just the clip of, well, actually, I don't know, maybe, it's Sergeant Lim transmitting, yes.
because if memory serves, when Sergeant Lim was calling in for medical aid, one could hear Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe. Right?
When Sergeant Lim is transmitting, I don't recall what he was transmitting, you can hear on 659 Mr. Ellis saying that he couldn't breathe.
And that's captured in the background,
Correct.
right? And the reason why I'm focusing on that is that he said he did hear Officer Sergeant Lim make the call in for medical aid. And I believe that, as I said, was said at the time that he made that call. So I'm wondering if that's a moment where he's recalling hearing Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe.
My intent is to ask him to listen to both of these and ask him. He describes it as Mr. Ellis said it in a remarkably calm voice. My
Right.
intent was to ask him to listen to both of those and see if either one of those that we hear in 614 or 659 are the occasion that he described as remarkably calm, or if it's something different. And I think that that's obviously relevant to how many times Mr. Ellis said it, and whether or not these are the occasions, and whether or not, if he says one of these are, then obviously that may go to the issue of the jury deciding whether or not that was remarkably calm.
But that's just contradiction with another piece of evidence that we already have admitted. What's the point of showing it to him except to replay evidence we've already heard?
It's the point, Your Honor, is to ask him whether or not those are the times that it's captured. He has described it a specific way, that when Mr.
Right.
Ellis said it to him, it was in a remarkably calm and normal voice.
So are you suggesting that none of those occasions were in a calm voice?
I don't know, that's why I want to ask
Well,
him.
you know better than any of us. You've listened to this how many times?
I haven't asked him this, he's not ever listened to these.
No, you've
I
listened
know.
to him. You said you don't know.
I have my own interpretation of them, but I want to know if he says this was the time.
Well, I don't want him to be confronted with something that happened at a time he wasn't there, for instance.
Well, these are both times when he was there. These are shown, because the
Right,
private video
but
shows
is-
the car, and then it shows him arriving.
Or either one of those, could either one of those be described as a calm voice?
I don't think so, but he obviously thinks that there is, and so there might be a difference as to what his interpretation of it is.
Well, if you're confronting him with something that he didn't hear, that's a problem.
Well, Your Honor, I mean.
That's why I was wondering about the one with Sergeant Lim, because we know he heard Sergeant Lim call in for medical aid, so we know he was listening then, and I believe that's when we heard Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe, at least on that occasion. It was picked up on his cell phone or something. And those corresponded. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. Am I wrong
Well,
about
it's
that?
not that it's,
Am I wrong about the timing?
Well, my understanding of the timing, Your Honor, if I understand Officer Ford correctly in prior statements, is that the time he heard it, I believe, was after Mr. Ellis was hobbled. So the times before that, they're just not relevant for cross-examination purposes. If they want to pinpoint one time that's already part of this record here and say, is this what you're referring to, then I probably don't have a problem with that, but if they're gonna go back and have him guess about other times, is that what you were talking about? Was that what you were talking about when we know that it wasn't what he was talking about? That's a problem.
well, just so we're clear, both of these times are after the hobble was called for. So these aren't going back in time. Neither one of these, 614 and 659, the testimony has been, both occurred, and you can see from the video, after Defendant Rankine and Officer Ford were present. So these are both times when it was said that it's captured on the audio, that where Officer Ford, by his own admission, was there. And the timing is critical, Your Honor. I mean, obviously, the number of times that Mr. Ellis said it, who heard it, in the manner in which it was
We've got
said.
all that into evidence already.
Well, but with this witness, Your Honor, this witness is saying, I only heard it one time.
Yes.
And the question is whether or not that is credible. And one of the ways that it may not be credible is that it was said other times. Another way is that it's the times that we are having captured here are not the times that he's talking about were remarkably calm, normal voice. So it goes to his credibility with respect to the statements that he's made about whether or not he heard it at that time.
But just to be clear on the times they're trying to use, at least I want to be clear, because there's the request for hobbles, and you hear that, and then like there's two requests, and it takes some time, then he's hobbled. It's after that point, if you hear it, it may have some relevance. The times before that, they're not relevant for purposes of her examination of Mr. or Officer Ford, who's indicated he only recalls it one time.
Well, Your Honor, I would also just point out, if it's not 614, and which was after the hobbles were called for, then the jury, it is relevant, because the jury can also conclude there was yet another time when Mr. Ellis said that he couldn't breathe that wasn't captured on the audio of these two occasions. And that's an important fact that the jury should be entitled to conclude based on if he says that neither one of these times are the occasions.
So Ms. Eek's position is, at least in part, that, look, if he said it 3 times, well, we can establish that Officer Ford was present, and he only heard 1. It doesn't matter what his tone of voice was or anything else. We just simply know that it was said 3 times, and he only picked up on 1 of them. And does that tell us anything about his ability to recall or take in events at the time of this incident? So isn't she entitled to at least ask about that?
Judge, on this first video that they want to play, I don't know why, but on my version of it, it doesn't have that time clock running. And I'm comparing it to the transcript that we all worked together to create. And I think that at that moment, Officer Rankine and Officer Ford are just getting out of their car and starting to run up to the scene at this point. So, I mean, I don't think they're actually even on scene yet, or they're just getting there when you can hear it. And the other time, through Lim's radio, I mean, I think that actually was removed from the transcript because it's not all that clear, and we don't even know. It sounds like an echo. You can't really hear if it's duplicative of something else. I mean, that's part of the issue with they've authenticated this through Grant Fredericks. They haven't brought in anyone from dispatch. They haven't brought anyone of how this dispatch record was created, which they're now using to try and incriminate, I guess, Officer Ford and our clients somehow.
Well, I don't know, incriminate anybody, but.
Yeah, well, it seems that way. He's admitted that he's told Miss Eakes that he heard him say, "I can't breathe." I mean, on the other occasion, I think that they're starting to run up at that moment. And then on Sergeant Lim's version in the radio, it's not even on the transcript because we couldn't hear it and we didn't know where it came from.
Maybe he could hear it. Well, one of the reasons we took things off the transcript is it was like, well, the juries can listen to this and maybe they can hear something on there that maybe hasn't been picked up by Mr. Hallamore? Maybe that's one of those things. Maybe that's where he heard it. And maybe one of the reasons it was faint is because it was calm and quiet. I don't know. But he was present, so he could have heard something that isn't picked up on the microphone. Well, I do think Ms. Eakes is entitled to, if she once establishes that he was present when a particular sound was made, to point out that this sound was made at this point in time and you didn't hear that? Yes or no? Yeah, I didn't hear it. Well, that's not what I heard. What I heard sounded different from that, and whatever his answer might be. But I think she's entitled to ask the question, I guess.
If she's allowed to do that, Your Honor, which except that she should have to put it in the context, okay, this was before the hobbles were placed on, so that he knows what she's referring to, as opposed to just throwing it out there as if that was after the hobbles were placed on. I think he's entitled to have that information, just like he'd be entitled to have, if he was being cross-examined with a prior statement, to have a transcript in front of him. He's entitled to have that information on his questions.
No. I mean, I get your point, but that isn't necessarily the point of the examination here. The point is, there were things to be observed that he may not have observed. In this case, maybe it's the sound of Mr. Ellis saying that. And she can point that out. So, but I want you to take a check on these exhibits and make sure that the ones we're talking about are the ones that the audios actually occurred after Officer Ford would have even been there.
I did, but you're certainly welcome to look, and I compared it to 18A, which is the transcript. But you can see in 614, and I can play it for the court right now, you can see that they arrive and run up.
So you're gonna play the video and the audio.
Well, if you don't want me to play the video, I mean, the video, to the point that the council just made, shows that they're there.
Okay. Let's have the jury back. You can do that. Okay. Is this like the other one?
Yeah, a little longer.
Okay. Welcome back, officer.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, you got the big bowl of candy. It's not even a bowl, it's a basket of candy.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Please be seated. Continuing, you ready, Ms. Eakes?
Thank you. Officer Ford, before we took the break, I was asking you, you testified that when you heard Mr. Ellis say that he couldn't breathe, that he said it in a remarkably calm and normal voice. Is that right?
That is correct.
I'm going to play for you Exhibit 614 and have you watch. You'll see it on your screen. It'll also come up here, and listen to the audio and tell me if what you hear on that is the occasion where you heard Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe.
Okay.
Was that the occasion where you heard Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe?
I believe so, yes.
Now, you described Mr. Ellis moving like he was a worm. Could Mr. Ellis have been moving like that because he couldn't breathe?
Your Honor, I would object that question.
I know it's running around.
Based on your training, have you learned about people who may have involuntary movements because they're not able to get air?
No,
You never learned that?
no.
Objection is answered.
Answers stands.
All right. I want to play a second clip for you and ask you if you heard Mr. Ellis on this occasion say he couldn't breathe. We can play 659, please.
I object because he's answered already.
Overruled.
Did you hear Mr. Ellis say, do you want to play
Could
that
you play it
again?
again, please?
I know it fast.
One more time, please.
Did you hear Mr. Ellis say it on that occasion?
No.
Is it possible that Mr. Ellis could have been trying to move when he was wiggle worming because he was trying to get pressure off of his back and
Your Honor,
chest?
objections.
Join.
Sustained.
Right, now you testified that Mr. Ellis, after you arrived, defendant Collins, I believe you said, asked for hobbles, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Did defendant Collins tell you that Mr. Ellis had already said he couldn't breathe before he put the hobbles on?
No.
And you were never trained in the academy about hobbles, is that right?
That is correct.
And you weren't trained at TPD, at the Tacoma Police Department, about hobbles? Did you even carry hobbles?
No, I did not.
Were you aware that the hobble that was used in this occasion was only 29 inches long?
I was not aware of that, no.
We have exhibit 100. I'll show you what's been marked and admitted as exhibit 100. Does that appear to you to be the hobble that was used that night on Mr. Ellis?
I'm not 100% sure.
Sorry. You're not sure?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Now, you indicated that the hobble was looped around Mr. Ellis's ankles and then through the handcuffs and then back. Is that right?
And then hooked onto itself, yes.
Okay. And explain to us, if you can, where was the strap that was placed around his ankles?
I object, Your Honor, lack of foundation. It hasn't been identified by his witnesses.
Well, it is a hobble. We don't know for this witness whether it's the same one, but the question is where his feet were. He would have, I assume he saw that on Mr. Ellis, so he can testify about it.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And
Can you say the question one more time, please?
sure. Tell us, you said that the hobble was put on Mr. Ellis's ankles. How was it put on Mr. Ellis's ankles?
If I recall, it was like this loop went around both ankles, was tightened, and that carabiner end went under the handcuffs and looped back onto the restraint.
Okay. And so so it was tightened and then looped around and came back, is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
And is it your testimony that once that hobble was placed around his ankles and then looped underneath the handcuffs and back hooked onto itself, that still Mr. Ellis's legs were at a 90-degree angle?
That's what I recall, yes.
And were Mr. Ellis's legs ever not at a 90-degree angle?
Probably what,
Well, hold on, you mean after he was hobbled? I mean, obviously before he was hobbled they were.
I can ask it more clearly. Before Mr. Ellis was hobbled, when you were holding his legs, were they ever at anything other than a 90-degree angle?
yes, when I was pushing them down towards his butt, they were.
Okay, so at one point you were pushing Mr. Ellis's feet further than 90 degrees, but towards his butt, is that right?
That is correct.
And then once the hobble was placed on Mr. Ellis, were his feet ever at anything other than a 90-degree angle?
I'm not sure.
And would you agree that Mr. Ellis, when he was in that position, he wouldn't have been able to stand up?
Yes, that is correct. He would not have been able to stand up.
Thank you. I thought it was a bad question on my part. And you would agree that Mr. Ellis couldn't have run away when he was restrained in that position?
That is correct.
And at the point that Mr. Ellis was hobbled and the hobble was connected through the handcuffs, the fight for Mr. Ellis was over. Is that correct?
Overruled, you may answer.
The fight was over. Is that what was your question?
Yes.
Yes.
And Mr. Ellis became calm. Is that correct?
Other than when he began thrashing around again, that is correct.
And would you agree that Mr. Ellis was under control at that point?
At that point, yes.
And do you recall in your previous interviews, the one you gave on March 9th, describing holding Mr. Ellis down for several minutes?
I believe so, yes. He's acknowledged it, but
Well, I think it's out of context too, potentially. If you wanna ask him a question about to complete the thing, that's fine. You can do it now if
I'll
you
have you
want.
take a look at another exhibit then. I'll show you 756A. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes,
Handing you what's been marked as 756A. Do you recognize that, Officer Ford?
Yes.
And is that the interview that you gave on March 9th, 2020 to the Pierce County Sheriff's Office?
That is correct.
And if you take a look at page 12 of that statement, the bottom of page 12, starting at line 22, and then onto the next page, down through line 6.
Your Honor, objection. Is there a question pending, or are we being asked to refresh his recollection?
the movie's just asking him to look at it.
Perhaps I wasn't clear, I was following up because of the objection. Let me know when you've had a chance to look at that.
And which line do you want me to get down to?
Look at line 22 through 25, and then on to the next page, lines 1 through 6. Page 12? Sure. Page 12 and then the top of 13. Let me know when you're done reviewing it.
Done.
Okay. And you were being asked about what happened after fire arrived, correct? At that point?
I believe so, yes.
And you were describing having gone back to your car with Defendant Rankine, correct?
I don't know if he came back to the car at that specific time, but
Okay. Were you describing you yourself going back to the car?
yes,
Right. And you described that when you went back to the car, you were kind of checking yourself for injuries and catching your breath, correct?
that is correct.
And you were saying that you were tired from several minutes of holding Mr. Ellis down, correct?
That is correct.
And then you were checking to make sure that you didn't have any injuries and getting your breath back, correct?
That is correct.
Now, during those several minutes when you were holding Mr. Ellis down, Officer Rankine was also touching Mr. Ellis, is that correct?
That is correct.
And he was also holding him down, correct?
That is
I
correct.
object, like the foundation, since that's not evidence on the several minutes preamble to the question.
It just feels awkward because holding down for several minutes obviously included the times before he was under control. So I don't know whether you're trying to talk about the entire period of the event or after after Mr. Ellis was under control, or what? And I think it leaves a misleading impression if we don't identify that.
After Mr. Ellis was under control, did you continue to hold him down?
When you say under control, do you mean in hobble restraints?
Yes, in hobble restraints.
At that time, I transitioned to the front of him.
So after Mr. Ellis was hobbled, did you have any contact in touching him after that?
I think I may have rested my hand on his leg or something, but
Otherwise, you were on the front of him?
yes.
And so, I'll strike that. Now, at the time that you said that when fire arrived, you went up to talk to fire, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you didn't tell fire that Mr. Ellis had said he couldn't breathe?
I don't know if I said that to them or not. I recall running up to them and saying, hey, I think it's possible excited delirium. We need you guys over there to help him now.
Are you saying that you might have told them that he said he couldn't breathe?
I don't know if I did.
Do you think it was important to tell the fire that Mr. Ellis had been saying he couldn't breathe?
Remember either way.
Overruled, you may answer.
I'm not sure if I said he couldn't breathe or not.
You think it was important to tell fire that Mr. Ellis had said that he couldn't breathe?
I let them know that he was unresponsive.
And did you think it was important to tell them that Mr. Ellis had said that he couldn't breathe?
In hindsight, yes.
But you didn't tell him at that time?
No, ma'am.
And to your knowledge, Defendant Rankine never told fire that Mr. Ellis had said he couldn't breathe?
I'm not sure.
You never heard him say that?
Objection foundation is
Overruled, you may answer.
I'm not sure.
You're not sure if he said that?
I'm not sure if he said that now.
Now, you said earlier that it's important to call for priority medical aid if someone says they can't breathe, correct?
Yes.
And you did not call for priority medical aid, did you?
No. Sergeant Lim did.
And Sergeant Lim is the only one who called for fire, correct?
That is correct. He was standing over us, watching everything transpire.
And so your memory is that Sergeant Lim was there standing over the entire time after Mr. Ellis was in custody until fire arrived?
I know he arrived shortly after Officer Rankin and I.
When Sergeant Lim arrived, was Mr. Ellis already in hobbles?
I'm not sure.
And is it your testimony, though, that after Sergeant Lim arrived, he stayed next to you and Officer Rankin and Mr. Ellis the entire time?
I'm not.
the entire time it's favored.
Until fire arrived?
I believe so, yes. He was right above us because I remember looking up and I remember hearing him calling for fire.
And in fact, the first time that he called for fire, he didn't ask for priority aid, did he?
I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure he just said something about send fire or have fire respond or something along the lines of that.
It wasn't until much later that he asked for fire to be told priority, correct?
I remember when Mr. Ellis was on his side and I asked Timmy if, because I started to put pieces together as to what was possibly going on. I said, is he warm? And Timmy said, yes, he's burning up. And he said it's something about his pulse, which I don't exactly recall what he said about Mr. Ellis's pulse. But I was like, he just fought with officers. He's making these noises. He's incredibly strong. I think this might be excited delirium. And I remember saying that out loud. And I remember Sergeant Lim saying, have fire step it up, which means get here as quick as possible.
Okay. So it was at that point that Sergeant Lim said, step it up or call for priority for fire, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And that happened right next to Mr. Ellis while he was still hogtied on the ground?
That is correct.
Now, would you agree that after Mr. Ellis stopped fighting and once he was in hobbles, was there any reason he couldn't be sat up at that point?
I'm not sure how we'd facilitate that, but that's not something I thought about at the time.
And what do you mean you couldn't facilitate it at that point?
I'm not sure if that's something we could facilitate, meaning the way he was secured, I don't know how we'd set him up.
Because his feet were tied behind his back with his handcuffs?
That is correct.
Could the hobble have been moved to the front of Mr. Ellis?
That's not possibly yes, but I'm not sure.
Now, after Mr. Ellis was rolled onto his side, at some point he did stop responding. Is that, or I'm sorry, after he was on his stomach, he did stop responding, correct?
That is correct.
And I think you said earlier that you heard Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe, but you actually didn't hear him say any other words, correct?
That is correct.
There wasn't any sort of gibberish or incoherent words, were there?
Not that I recall, no.
Mr. Ellis wasn't swearing or cursing at you or anyway?
Not that I heard, no.
And he didn't threaten to kill you or make any comments of a threatening nature?
No, ma'am.
And when he was rolled back to his side, he was unresponsive, is that right?
You're talking about,
At some point when you moved him onto his side, was he unresponsive?
Same objection.
Overruled.
yes. I remember looking into his eyes and I was saying, sir, please relax, just breathe. We've got the fire department coming. And I remember looking at him in the eyes, and it was like he was just looking through me.
And he never responded to you, did he?
No.
And you would agree that that was a sign that something was wrong with Mr. Ellis, correct?
I would call that unresponsive, so that's yes.
After Mr. Ellis went unresponsive then, and still and quiet, how many other officers were at the scene?
I'm a lot. I'm not sure. There are people everywhere. There are
More
officers
than a dozen?
everywhere. Possibly, yes.
And all of those folks were armed, is that right?
Yes.
And all of them had been trained, as far as you know, in crisis? In dealing with people in crisis?
I'm not sure. There were multiple agencies there.
And you never removed the hobbles from Mr. Ellis, even after he became unresponsive?
I did not know.
And nobody unclipped him from the handcuffs?
Not until the fire department got there.
And nobody sat him up?
Not that I recall, no.
And nobody started CPR on him?
No.
All right, I want to talk about the spit hood.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're at recess for 15 minutes. Please do not discuss case among yourselves with anyone else.
fact, when the restraints were removed from Mr. Ellis, he just kind of went limp, right?
I didn't remove the restraints, so I'm not sure.
Did you see him when the restraints were removed?
Yes.
And was he limp?
Yes, he was just laying there.
And he continued to be unresponsive, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you talked about fire, and is it correct that you thought it took a long time for fire to get there?
Yes, that is correct.
And in fact, in some of your prior interviews, you described it as it seemed like an eternity for them to get there, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, you thought that if fire had shown up with advanced life support, Mr. Ellis could have been okay, right? Do you recall testifying or saying previously that you thought if Mr. Ellis...
Hold on. Ask a question that's not impeachment out of the box.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not if fire had arrived earlier, Mr. Ellis would have been okay?
I already sustained this objection.
To your knowledge, was fire ever told that Mr. Ellis had been saying he couldn't breathe?
Your Honor, I think it's asked and answered.
You can ask fire what they were told. He's already answered this for himself.
Now, Mr. Officer Ford, you, I believe you said on direct that you weren't aware that a spit hood had been put on Mr. Ellis?
That is correct.
You don't recall ever seeing a spit hood on Mr. Ellis?
That is correct.
And you have no idea how it came to be on Mr. Ellis?
Not at that time, no.
And what do you say not at that time? What do you mean?
Your Honor, I'm gonna object. Sounds like counsel has
It may be calling for hearsay. Is this something someone told you?
Yes.
Objection sustained.
Now, you said that after Mr. Ellis was in hobbles, you moved to the front of him and you were looking at Mr. Ellis, is that right?
That is correct.
And you said you were looking at his eyes?
Yes.
And is it your testimony that even though you were looking at his face, that you never saw a spit hood on Mr. Ellis?
That is correct.
Never noticed anything at all obstructing his face?
No, ma'am.
When you saw Defendant Burbank and Collins that night, did you notice any visible injuries on them?
I remember Officer Collins' face was red, and I don't recall any like blood or anything on either of them.
There were no injuries to either one of them that you saw?
Not that I could see.
Now, Officer Burbank and Collins didn't tell you how the interaction with Mr. Ellis had started, did they?
No.
You just knew that there had been mic clicks and kind of what brought you to the scene, correct?
That is correct.
And it's your testimony that they never told you how it was that they came to be interacting with Mr. Ellis?
That is correct.
Now, I think you testified on direct about the fact that you had seen Officer Collins and Officer Burbank just moments before the mic clicks, correct?
That is correct.
And you were at a traffic stop with him at 96th and A?
That is correct.
If I could have you be shown on the screen, and this is not yet admitted, Exhibit 13, please. I can also hand it to you if that's easier.
I think I can read it here.
Okay, it's a 2-page document. And do you recognize that document?
It actually says it's a 3-page document. I don't know if there's anything on
Well, you're right, I didn't realize it was double-sided.
I've
I'll
never.
hand you the
Oh,
physical copy of
okay.
it. This is Exhibit 13. Do you recognize that to be the CAD from the stop that you talked about, that you had with Officer Collins and Officer Burbank
That is correct.
on March 3rd?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. I would offer State's Exhibit 13.
No objection, Your Honor.
Not sure of the relevance of it to the illustrative purposes, but here's the,
Is there an objection?
yes. The admission,
Illustrative purposes, we would not have an objection.
no problem with the illustrative purposes.
that's what I suggested, Your Honor.
There you go.
So I'm sorry, I don't object to that.
Officer Ford, have you seen this document before?
No.
Did you ever check the CAD report for this matter before today?
No.
The state can agree to admit it for illustrative purposes, Your Honor, that's fine.
No objections to that?
Your Honor, at this time, I'm going to connect with the foundation for this document.
Can I join in there?
I'll ask some additional questions if the court wants more
I'll
time.
sustain the objection, at least for now.
Officer Ford, are you familiar with the CAD report?
Yes.
Okay. And is that something that you rely on as police officers?
Yes.
And looking at the CAD report on, for this particular call, does it show what time you arrived at that traffic stop?
That's a yes or a no, by the way.
Your Honor, object to the question here.
It's not hearsay, Your Honor. It's
It's just a yes or no. That's why I say it's a yes or no. Does it simply show that or not?
Well, I'm looking here. Yes.
And does it also show what time you departed that call? Or you cleared that call? Or I'm sorry, I should say, that shows that you're available again.
Yes.
All right. I'd offer it again, Your Honor.
Well, it shows those things. Are they, is that accurate? Officer Ford?
It,
The times that are reflected in this document, are they accurate of what happened that night?
I believe so, yes. Typically, we'll say we're en route to back, like someone would be on a traffic stop or call a traffic stop, and I'll say, Henry 031, en route to back. And once I say that, dispatch will put in here that I'm en route to assist them.
So, so in this case, is it telling us when you were en route to assist, or is it telling us when you were actually?
It looks like arrival time was 23:18.
Well, the question is that right? Was that right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And it's got an available time.
Yes.
And is that when you were actually left the scene, or is that when you said you were available?
That's when we said we were available.
And so you might have left then or some other time?
It would have been around that time.
Okay. And what time was that?
23:18 and 31 seconds.
All right, so only after 15 or 20 seconds after you arrived?
That is correct.
Okay. I'll allow that testimony, but I'm not going to allow the exhibit without a further foundation.
And Officer Ford, then, and that's consistent with your memory that you were at that stop very briefly, correct?
That is correct.
And the time that it shows that you said you were available, or you and Officer Rankine, was 23:18:31, correct?
Correct.
And that's, as you recall, do you recall that you arrived and saw the officers and they gave you the thumbs up, correct?
That is correct.
And then you drove away, is that right?
Officer Rankin was driving, but yes, we drove away.
You and Officer Rankine drove away?
Yes, ma'am.
And Officer Burbank and Collins were still at that stop, correct?
I believe they were just clearing it, but yeah, they were still there when we left.
You were asked some questions on voir dire by defense counsel about Sergeant Lim, and it's correct that he was at the scene, correct?
That is correct.
But he wasn't directing anything, correct?
Not that I recall.
And in fact, there was no specific person who was directing the events at the scene, correct?
Jeff stated correctly.
Well, I'll permit this. You can answer.
No, there was no one specific point person that I recall, no.
If I could have just a moment, Your Honor. That's all I have. Thank you, Officer Ford.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Officer Ford. Just on that last comment there by Ms. Eakes, were you aware that Lim directed Officers Burbank and Collins go back to the car and wait for him to interact with them?
I remember seeing them walk to their car, but I don't remember him directing them to do that.
Okay, and when they were walking to their vehicle, that was right after Mr. Ellis was hobbled, correct?
I object that it's leading.
Overruled. Give me an answer.
I believe that was shortly after he was hobbled, yes.
Well, when you say shortly after, we're talking within seconds, correct?
I'm not sure about how long
Okay, you
went
don't know
by.
the exact time?
No, sir.
Okay. Lim was there when Mr. Ellis was being hobbled, is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
If we could pull up Exhibit 898, please. You'll see it on your screen, officer, or in your own screen as well. Has it popped up there yet?
Yes, it's there.
This has previously been admitted as 898. It's a timeline of various arrival times of officers. Do you see where it indicates that you and your partner, Officer Rankine, arrived?
Yes, 23, 24, 19.
And then Sergeant Lim, right, at the time, correct?
Yes,
And he is at 23, 24, 44.
that is correct.
That's within 25 seconds of when you and Rankin arrived, right?
Yes,
And at the time that Sergeant Lim arrived, Mr. Ellis was not in hobbles yet, correct?
that is correct.
And ultimately, Sergeant Lim actually helped put him in hobbles. Is that correct, your recollection?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Do you know who helped put him in hobbles?
I remember seeing a county deputy's badge
Okay.
and then possibly another TPD officer, but I'm not sure who.
All right, so there's a arrival time at 23:24:50, which of course is 6 seconds after Sergeant Lim. Do you recognize that name, Messinio?
I do.
And he's with Pierce County Sheriff's Department,
That is correct.
and that's the type of badge you would have seen?
Yes,
Okay. And then do you know Sanders, who's also from the county, at 23:25:04, another 4 seconds later?
yes.
Okay. You recall him arriving?
I recall him being there, but I don't recall exactly when he arrived.
Okay. When you recall him being there, was he hands-on with Mr. Ellis?
I'm not sure.
Was Deputy Messino, to your knowledge or recollection?
I'm not sure. I just remember seeing the patch of the Pierce County Sheriff's Department.
Okay. Now, when you arrived there at 23:24:19, as you testified, certainly Mr. Ellis at that time was not secured, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And that's when you came running to this park. You actually jumped out of the car before the car parked and came running to where Burbank and Collins were, along with Mr. Ellis, correct?
That is correct.
And there was a struggle going on, right?
Yes.
And you didn't see any injuries to them later on, but you did indicate that Officer Burbank was gassed, right?
Yes.
And gassed meaning what?
Completely out of strength, like, or out of, it's just you're so tired, you're exhausted, out of energy.
And he was so exhausted, once you guys got, before you got the hobbles on, but there was, I think you said 4 of you on Mr. Ellis. And when I say on, I mean holding his legs down and his arms down.
That is correct.
And I think you said when you arrived, Officer Collins was either had hold of his legs. Did I
That is
understand
correct.
that correctly?
Yes.
And you said Officer Burbank was kind of up at the upper torso end. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you know how he was situated?
I don't remember exactly. I remember. No, I don't remember.
Okay. Just that he was on the upper part of the body.
That is correct.
You're not saying he was sitting on his back or anything like that.
No, sir.
You're not saying he was putting his elbows into his back or anything like that,
No, sir.
or doing anything inappropriately, correct?
That is correct.
And in fact, when you arrived there and your participation in the scene, everything that you saw and participated in seemed to be appropriate.
That is correct. If it wasn't, I would have said something.
Right. And it's one thing you indicated earlier, just moments ago, that you, I think you said you, in hindsight, you wished you would have told Fire that Mr. Ellis had said at one time that he couldn't breathe. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, sir.
I think when you started direct this morning, you'd indicated, and I'm not going to go into all your details, but you've been dealing with this situation for a couple of years now, trying to reflect as to what happened.
That is correct.
And you second guess yourself, and that as part of your, again, I don't want to get into details, as part of what you're going through. Is that right?
What do you mean second guess?
Do you wish you would have done things differently?
I wish we were able to save his life, yes.
Yeah. And that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
And when you got there, after you got the scene secured, that's what you were trying to do. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's when you put him along with Officer Rankine in the recovery position, correct?
That is correct.
And when you said at one point he was unresponsive, do you mean that in a medical sense, or he was not responding to you when you were talking to him?
He was not responding to me when I was talking to him.
You didn't mean that in a medical sense.
I'm not a doctor, so no.
Fair enough. And so when the fire arrived there, you indicated that you told them what you thought at the time he was experiencing. Correct?
Yes.
And you were giving him as much information that you thought was important at that time to get them going, basically.
That is correct.
Okay. And you're relying on Sergeant Lim to communicate properly with Fire when he made the call to dispatch, correct?
That is correct.
And that's normal procedure, right?
Yes.
Okay. So as that was going on, do you know if officers Burbank and or Collins were out of the scene? When I say the scene, I mean on hands with Mr. Ellis before or after Masyih and Sanders arrived?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay. And you don't recall it this
I don't
time?
recall that
Could
now.
have been beforehand, could have been after.
Possibly, yes.
And definitely you're absolutely sure that they were no longer hands-on when the hobbles were placed on them, correct?
After the hobbles were placed on him?
Okay, let me repeat, I think. When the hobbles were placed on Mr. Ellis, you know at some point Collins and Burbank were no longer hands-on, right?
Yes.
And I think in your statement that was referred to earlier by Ms. Eakes, in that statement you indicated when you and Officer Rankine arrived, you took over for Collins and Burbank eventually, correct?
That is correct.
And at that time it was you, Rankine, Masyih, was he involved at that point?
I'm not to be honest with you, I'm not sure what deputy
Okay.
was involved.
Sanders?
I'm not sure.
Okay. How about any other TPD officers?
I'm not sure, no.
Okay. And for the record, TPD is Tacoma Police Department, just so we're on the same page here. Now, but they were definitely, hobbles were on, and then who's there? And the only two you remember is yourself and Officer Rankine at that point?
Yes, and the entire south end of Tacoma.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Easy to sit here and not remember, you don't remember a spit hood being placed on him.
No, I do not.
Here, you're not experiencing the stress of the event, correct?
That's correct.
The unpredictability of the event, you're not experiencing that?
No.
And there's certain things you just don't recall, is that fair to say?
Yes.
And I don't know if that's what you're trying to resolve internally, is that something you're trying to resolve internally?
Yeah, it was an incredibly traumatic event that I think about every single day.
Okay. When you arrived there, now you indicate, well, let's strike that. You indicated and that you saw nothing inappropriate occurring when you got there, correct?
That is correct.
Mr. Ellis bucking?
That is correct.
And moving like worming or whatever. I think you said he moved about 2 feet once you got there.
Yes, that is correct.
And you don't know how far he moved before you got there, obviously, correct?
That is correct.
And you don't know how long that struggle was going on, other than I think you indicated the mic clicks were, what, 4 minutes earlier approximately? Did I understand that correctly?
I'm not sure, however long it took us to get there.
Yeah. As you sit here today, do you recall approximately how long it took you to get there?
No, it would have been between like 2 and 5 minutes if I had to
Fair
estimate.
Okay, at least a couple minutes then. Okay. And you indicated on direct, I think you said you were trained not to put your weight on a person's back. Is that right? Did I understand that correctly?
They train us to put our knees right above the shoulders.
Okay. And there's one thing to be trained to do something, but you're also in Tacoma police policy. Sometimes you have to deviate from your training even. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that's in the policy, right?
Yes, we're allowed to use outside training that we received, like martial arts or things like that.
And so if things go sideways and certain things are not working, you're able to go outside your training.
That is correct.
And that's not unusual, is it?
No,
And in fact, it's basically part of your training
that is correct.
to get the person under control.
That is correct, as long as it's reasonable.
That's the key word. What's reasonable under the circumstances, right? Is that
Yes,
the answer? And specifically under the circumstances as it appears to you as an officer at the moment of the event, correct?
that is correct.
And then, so that's what you saw happening with Officers Burbank and Collins when you arrived, that they were trying to secure Mr. Ellis, correct?
That is correct.
In your opinion, he was not secured at that point.
No,
And when you come to a scene, if you get a dispatch call, you come in, or you get the call, number one, is protect the public. Is that fair to say?
yes,
Number two, protect yourself, correct?
that is correct.
And then once you get everything secure, and we talked about caretaking function, that's when you worry about the caretaking function of the suspect, correct?
That is correct.
Because until he's secured, everyone's at risk, potentially,
That is correct.
including himself, quite frankly, correct?
That's correct.
And you saw, if I understood your testimony here a bit ago, that he certainly was not secure until those hobbles were placed on him.
That is correct.
And he appeared to be secure, and that's when he got put on his side in the recovery position, right?
That is correct.
And then he started, for lack of a better word, acting up again.
Yes, that's correct.
And so, even though he's maybe not a threat to you at that point or to the others, he's potentially a threat to himself, correct?
That is correct.
And then part of the caretaking function would prevent him from hurting himself and have him roll over until he calms down again, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And he wasn't left on his in the prone position for a very long time at that point, is that correct?
That is correct.
And then he was moved again in a recovery position. And I just want to make sure I understand correctly, Officer Ford. Is that when you moved to the front of him and kind of talked to him a little bit?
Yes.
Okay. And as far as when you remember, he indicated that he could not breathe in a calm voice. Was that after that time, or was that before? Well, let me go back. I'm sorry. Ahead of myself. Yeah, I know. Well, I don't either, so that's why I'm starting over. Okay, so let me start over. When you heard Mr. Ellis say, "I can't breathe" in a calm voice, was that after the first time that you guys put him in the recovery position?
I believe it was before he was placed in the recovery position.
Okay. Was
The
it
first
after
time.
the hobbles were actually on him?
I believe so.
Okay, that's the best of your recollection as you sit here today.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's fine, fair enough. And again, after the hobbles, you stayed on hands at that point, and then the only two people you remember being hands-on at that point is you and your partner, Officer Rankin, correct?
That is correct.
But there were a couple other people around.
Lots of other people, yes.
Right. Okay. Now, you said Officer Burbank was training you for a period of time when you became part of the TPD, right?
That is correct.
How long was he is that considered a supervisor or what?
My training officer, my last phase of police field training.
And how many months did he train you? Or
One.
weeks, for that matter?
4 weeks, 1 month,
4
16
okay.
shifts.
And do you remember what year that was?
2019, I want to say. Wait,
Okay. This was March 2020.
so it would have been 2019, I believe.
Okay. And how would you describe him as a colleague in the capacities of being training you?
We worked in the south end of Tacoma, which is really not the easiest area to work in. He was always calm, respectful. We've had uses of force, and once the use of force was over, he was all right. Hey man, fire's gonna come check you out. We'll get you to jail, and that's just how it's gonna go. He's always just been super calm.
And always treated the suspects with dignity.
Yes,
Did you ever have an issue with how he handled himself in those instances when he was training you?
no,
Okay. And you indicated he was always calm, and I think you mentioned on direct that when you heard his voice, that's something you never heard before.
that is correct.
You indicated in that interview with the Sheriff's Department that you, when you guys were rushing to the scene, you were thinking the worst.
Yes,
And the worst meant what?
that they were dead, or someone had killed them or shot them, or I thought they were gonna be dead when we got there.
And you mentioned your, whatever those things are called, your heart monitor, Fitbit, whatever is that?
Yes.
I don't have a Fitbit, obviously. But you were able to read it later on and say, my heart rate jumped way up
That is correct.
from its normal. What's your normal heart rate?
68 to 72.
So it was up 40 beats, 40 plus. Is that right?
That is correct.
And I think, I can't remember if I just asked you a bit ago, but when you got there along with Officer Rankin, you guys took over within a couple minutes from Officers Burbank and Collins, is that correct?
After the hobbles were
Place that.
placed on, yes.
So give me 1 second, Your Honor, please. I think I'm good, Your Honor, thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Mr. Arbenz?
Thank you. I'll ask a few questions here this afternoon. You mentioned that towards the end of this timeline here in Exhibit 898, that you ran over to tell the paramedic. You mind leaving it up? Thanks. Yeah. Disappear. That you ran over and told the paramedics that you thought Mr. Ellis might have excited delirium. Do you remember that?
I do remember that, yes.
Okay. Is it possible that while you were doing that, that's when the split hood ended up on Mr. Ellis?
I'm going to object. It calls for speculation.
Well, he was there, Your Honor, given his knowledge of the scene.
Well, I'll sustain the objection.
How long would you say you left Mr. Ellis's side to go talk to the paramedics?
I'd say less than a few minutes.
Okay, less than a few minutes. Okay, so there was a period of time that you were away from Mr. Ellis there towards the end of this timeline?
Yes,
Okay. And there were other officers that were present, right?
that is correct.
Okay. And could you actually see Mr. Ellis at that time when you were talking to the first responders, the paramedics?
There was a bunch of patrol cars to the east, and they parked behind all of them, so my view was obstructed.
Okay, all right. Could somebody pull up Exhibit 18A for me? And this has not been admitted except for illustrative purposes. It should end up on your screen there. You see that, Officer Ford?
Yes.
For illustrative purposes, you can show it to the jury if you care
Do
to.
you mind if I publish that, Your Honor?
Go right ahead.
Okay, if we could publish that, please. Could you scroll to page 4 of 6, please? And Officer Ford, looking at that exhibit on page 4 of 6, do you see when the time, or rephrase, do you see the time when the hobbles were requested?
Looks like 23, 24.
23, 24, 33?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then if we could switch back to Exhibit 898. And so 23, what do we say, 23, 24, 33? That's when the hobbles were requested, so about 11 seconds before Sergeant Lim arrived. Does that seem right to you?
Yes.
Okay. And then the hobbles were placed on Mr. Ellis fairly soon thereafter. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
And then once the hobbles were on, that's when my client, Officer Collins, and his partner, Officer Burbank, were sort of relieved from the scene. Fair to say?
Yes.
Okay, great. Now, have you worked alongside Officers Collins and Burbank before?
Yes.
And in particular, Officer Collins?
Yes.
Okay. And can you describe a little bit about the times that you've worked with him?
When I was in training in the 4 sector, which is where they were assigned, when Officer Burbank was my trainer, we were on the same squad. So when Officer Burbank wasn't training students, he and Officer Collins would ride together. So pretty much every day I was there, Officer Collins we were on the same squad, responding to calls together.
Okay. And did you observe him, out policing the public?
Yes.
Okay. And did you make an assessment of him as a police officer?
Yes, he has a really good way of like treating citizens with dignity and respect. Yeah, I've never seen him do anything that I considered questionable or something that I wouldn't do.
Okay. Never saw him use excessive force or anything like that?
No.
Okay. Did you ever see him use force?
Yes.
Okay. And you felt like it was appropriate force?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever socialized with Officer Collins?
Yes.
Okay. Have you met his wife?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. Has he met your husband?
Probably in passing, yes.
Okay. And so you guys had a friendship in addition to being colleagues. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. And was that the same with Officer Burbank?
Yes.
Okay. And then obviously with your partner, Officer Rankine.
That is correct.
Anyway, that relationship, those friendships would cause you to come in here and say something that's untruthful in this case?
Absolutely not, no.
In fact, is it fair to say that the fact that you guys are friends and you know each other on a personal level, that if somebody was making a mistake in a scene or on the street, that you would correct each other? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, we all have the duty to intervene.
Okay. And in the past, if one of you is observed doing something improperly, have the four of you ever corrected each other?
No,
Okay. So
but
then-
if the situation arose, yes, we would absolutely do that.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Now, you mentioned that on March 3rd, your first interaction, at least around the time of this situation with Mr. Ellis, you backed up Officer Collins and Officer Burbank on a traffic stop, is that right?
That is correct.
All right, and do you remember the nature of the stop?
No, I just heard him call out a traffic stop, and Officer Rankine drove that way.
Okay. Did you see the individuals that had been stopped?
I don't recall what they look like.
Okay. Do you remember if they were white, black, Mexican?
No.
Something like that? Okay. You then left the scene and went one way, and Officer Collins and Officer Burbank went another way. Sounds right. Sounds like, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And so then you heard the mic clicks. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And those caused you concern because there wasn't a following statement on the radio by one of them saying that that was an accidental mic click. Fair to say?
That is correct.
And then you actually heard a subsequent mic click. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
All right. And then you now testified that you guys were heading that way to help out, right?
That is correct.
And your heart rate spiked way up, 40, 50 points. Fair to say?
Yes.
And why the urgency? What about those mic clicks, Officers Collins and Burbank, caused your heart rate to spike like that?
They're an incredibly capable two-officer car. I mean, people would always talk about they can handle pretty much anything, and I've seen it. When I heard Officer Burbank scream on the radio 9-6 in Ainsworth, like, I've never heard his voice even go to that octave, so I was pretty freaked out. Yes.
And you said you've seen it before. Can you tell us about that?
Seen what before?
Well, when you were giving your answer, you said they're both very capable officers, and I've seen it before.
Yes.
Can you describe that, of course?
We work the south end of Tacoma. They don't always comply with the police, and a lot of these folks that we're going out to arrest are for violent felonies, drive-by shootings, assault 1, assault 2, domestic violence, burglary, things like that. And sometimes those folks don't want to go to jail, and we have to use force on them.
Okay. Now, in observing Officer Collins in particular having to use force, would you say he's a pretty capable officer in that regard?
Yes.
Okay, can you describe why?
I mean, he's muscularly built, and from what I know, he's trained in martial arts, so yeah, I mean, he appears very capable.
Okay. And so when you arrive on the scene, and we've seen the video where you jump out of your vehicle, you've described that Officer Burbank was placed more towards the top of Mr. Ellis, and that Officer Collins was on one of his legs. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And you said that Mr. Ellis was bucking so much that they actually were moving several feet. Is that right?
That is correct.
And were they moving towards the lane of traffic, towards a more dangerous area in the intersection?
That would have been southbound towards the eastbound side of traffic, so yes.
Okay, so they were actually in a dangerous spot, moving to an area that might even be more dangerous. Fair to say?
If he continued moving that way, yes.
Okay. And so you got involved, and you grabbed a leg, right?
That is correct.
And Ms. Eakes was saying that, or asking you whether Mr. Ellis was like intentionally kicking you, and I think you said no, and that his legs were flailing. Can you give us a little clarity on that?
Like they were just moving, like kind of like this.
Okay. Were you afraid you were going to get kicked?
Yes,
Okay, and that was just because it was an erratic motion that he was using?
that is correct.
Okay. Now, was Mr. Ellis screaming grunting and struggling during this time?
Yes.
Okay. And it has been suggested that when you were trying to hold him down in that moment, that you could have simply rolled him on his side and crossed his legs as a manner of restraint. Do you agree with that?
I mean, there's numerous ways to restrain someone, but that's not something I thought about at the time.
Okay. Is that because his legs were kicking and flailing and he was bucking?
Yes.
And just so we understand, the police force, Tacoma PD, has a chain of command. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. And so, when there's a superior officer on the scene, that's the person who's in charge of the scene. Fair to say?
Yes.
And we understand that Sergeant Lim was one of those folks, correct?
That is correct.
And there was another sergeant of yours from TPD that arrived also. Is that right?
That would have been Sergeant Rock.
Sergeant Rock. Okay. You mentioned, and I apologize for jumping around here, but I'm trying to get this done quickly. You mentioned that you felt like it took the fire department longer to get there than normal. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And so typically when you call fire, you can trust that they're going to be there fairly quickly in your experience. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. And this one, for whatever reason, seemed to take longer.
That is
Do
correct.
you have any knowledge as to why it took longer?
No.
You had no control over that, though, right?
No.
Nor did any of the other officers.
That is correct.
You mentioned that after, well, it sounds like fire arrives and they ask that you and the other officers remove the restraints, correct?
That is correct.
And that at some point the handcuffs were taken off, and that you felt the need to go pick up the handcuffs. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay, and why did you do that?
They can be used as weapons against us.
All right. But you've also said that Mr. Ellis was unresponsive.
Yes.
Okay. Did you have some fear that just because he was non-responsive, that he might still be dangerous?
Absolutely.
Why is that?
I mean, sometimes there are breaks in the fight. I've had people feign compliance or feign walking to my patrol car and kick me. You just never really know. And after having gone through what we had been through, while he was in handcuffs, I was terrified. Once he got taken out of handcuffs, the fight was going to be back on again.
And just because he was non-responsive, I mean, you're not a doctor, right?
That's correct.
All right. And you don't know that just because someone appears to be, as you would describe, non-responsive, that they are in any way in medical distress or necessarily incapable of causing future harm. Fair to say?
That's correct.
And just to be clear, you gave your statement on March 9th, so it was about 6 days after this incident, your first statement. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And you told the interviewers that Mr. Ellis, that you heard him say, "I can't breathe," the one time, right?
That is correct.
That's all I have. Thank you, Officer Ford.
Nothing further, John, you can think of.
Any further cross from the state?
Yes. Officer Ford, Mr. Ellis was never spitting, was he?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Said he wasn't spitting, was he?
I'll permit this. You may answer.
Not that I recall, ma'am.
You never saw him spit, did you?
Not that I recall, no.
Even when you were right in front of him, facing him, you didn't see him spit, correct?
Not at me, no.
And when you ran to get fire that you were asked about, you said they were about a block and a half away, is that right?
That's about accurate, yes, ma'am.
And Mr. Ellis was unresponsive at that time, correct?
That is correct.
He wasn't responding at all, correct?
Not when I was speaking to him, no.
Now, I think you testified that you were with Mr. Ellis the entire time except for when you stepped away to go get, or when you ran over to get fire, is that right?
That is correct.
Could we show the witness exhibit 22, which has been admitted, Your Honor?
22 was admitted. '22 was admitted.
Thank you. And if you can step down here, Officer Ford, it's on the big screen there. And you've seen this video before, correct?
I believe so.
And during the interviews, do you recall us showing you that video and asking you if you could identify anybody? Can we play the video?
There's somebody in the middle of that doggy pile.
You can stop it there. And Officer Ford, you're in that video, aren't you?
I believe I'm right here.
And you're standing up. Do you see where Mr. Ellis is?
Yes, he's
Oh.
in front of me.
All right. So you weren't down crouching with Mr. Ellis or talking to him at that point, correct? Okay. You can take your seat.
Oh,
Objection, baby system.
And you talked about Mr. Ellis wiggle worming. Just so we're clear, you never got into the eastbound lane of traffic, correct?
Not that I recall, no.
And in fact, you were primarily close to the curb with Mr. Ellis, is that right?
Yes,
And that would have been in the westbound traffic, correct?
that is correct.
And the patrol car was kind of blocking between you and any other traffic that might have come up, correct?
That is correct.
You know, you testified a moment ago that you were terrified that Mr. Ellis could have harmed you, is that correct?
Yes.
Even after he was hobbled?
I believe that was in the context of after he was taken out of restraints.
Now, Mr. Ellis never struck anybody, did he?
Objection, Your Honor. Foundation as to,
I'll clarify time. While you were there?
While I was there, no.
And he never threatened you, did he?
No.
And he didn't have any weapons on him?
Not that I saw, no.
And all the only motions that you saw from Mr. Ellis was him attempting to buck or wiggle worm, correct?
That is correct.
And that you had to apply all of your force to hold his legs, push his legs towards his butt, correct?
That is correct.
I could have just a moment. That's all I have. Thank you, Officer Ford.
you didn't say he, excuse me, you didn't verbally threaten anyone, but you considered him a physical threat, is that correct?
That is correct.
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
Nothing further, thank you.
okay. Mr. Ford, Officer Ford, you are excused.
Thank you, sir.
We're now left 4 o'clock, so we'll take our break for the day. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not discuss the case among yourselves with anyone else. Do not permit anyone to discuss the case with you or in your presence. We'll see you tomorrow.